Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're getting into one of history's biggest questions. Why did the Roman Empire fall? We're going to peel back the layers to see not just what happened, but how a single devastating day was really the final straw after centuries of cracks brought a giant to its knees. Let's dive in. We're not going to start at the very end. We're starting at a huge turning point, with a battle so bloody, so catastrophic, that local legend says it literally stained the landscape forever. Now, that's not just poetry. It's a memory of a day that completely changed the course of history. So picture this. The place is Adrianople. That's modern-day Edirne in Turkey. The date? August 9th, 378 AD. On this absolutely scorching summer day, the unthinkable happened. The Roman army, the most feared military machine in the world, marched out to crush a rebellion. They never came back. Look, it's hard to even wrap your head around the scale of this disaster. This wasn't just a lost battle. It was an annihilation. We're talking 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army just gone. An emperor dead on the field, and his body was never even recovered. An absolutely unprecedented humiliation. In a single afternoon, the myth of Roman invincibility was just shattered. And that right there is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Adrianopolis was a huge shock for sure, but it wasn't the cause. It was a symptom. A powerful empire doesn't just get wiped out in one bad afternoon. The truth is, the dominoes were already wobbly, weakened by problems that had been building up for generations. So, to really get what's going on, we have to look inside the empire itself. We need to peek under the hood and check out the deep-seated problems that turned this absolute giant into something so fragile, so brittle, that one hard push could start its final collapse. Okay, so the story you've probably heard is pretty simple, right? Savage barbarian hordes swarm the borders and destroy this great civilization. But modern historians, well, they argue for a much more complex reality. The migrations weren't the cause of Rome's fall. They were a consequence of an empire that was already breaking down from the inside. Politically, economically, the whole shebang. Yeah, this didn't happen overnight. For more than 200 years before Adrianople, the empire was getting hammered by one crisis after another. It started with plagues that killed millions. That was followed by a century of pretty much constant civil war and economic collapse. And all this led to a military that was Roman in name only, staffed by the very same barbarians it was supposed to be fighting. Just stop and think about the impact of something like the Antonine Plague. This wasn't just a health crisis, oh no. It was a crisis for everything. It crippled the economy because it wiped out taxpayers and farmers. It hollowed out the legions by killing off soldiers. It basically eroded the very fabric of Roman society, leaving the empire weaker and way less resilient for the next crisis that was just around the corner. Okay, so you've got an empire that's weakened from the inside. Now, let's turn our attention to the immense pressure that was starting to build on the outside. A storm was gathering far beyond the Roman frontiers. It all started thousands of miles away, on the steppes of Central Asia. A nomadic people known as the Huns arrived, and their push west set off this massive chain reaction, a true domino effect. One tribe pushed another, which pushed another, all of them heading west, towards the one symbol of stability they knew, the Roman border. And this part is so crucial to understand. The Goths who showed up at the Danube River in 376 AD, they were not a conquering army. They were desperate refugees. They were fleeing the Huns, they were starving from a massive famine, and they were begging, literally begging, for a safe place to settle. What did they get instead? They were met by corrupt Roman commanders who exploited them, sold their own children into slavery just for scraps of food, and basically treated them with absolute contempt. And here's the real irony. For centuries, Rome's own policies had kind of created these powerful barbarian groups. They used them as buffers on the frontier, propping up chieftains who depended on Roman gold. But when Rome's economy started to tank and that gold dried up, well, those same organized groups were now pretty motivated to come and take what they felt they were owed. So this is it. This is where it all comes to a head. The internal weakness, the external pressure, the desperate refugees, and the sheer mismanagement and arrogance of the Romans, it all collides in one explosive moment on the fields of Adrianople. That was roughly the number of Gothic warriors and their allies. And get this, they were outnumbered almost 3-1.
They were facing a Roman army of over 40,000 soldiers, led by an emperor, Valens, who was so overconfident he'd win that he refused to wait for reinforcements. He wanted all the glory for himself.
The battle itself was just a tactical nightmare for the Romans. First, they exhausted their soldiers on a long march in the brutal August heat. Then, the Gothic leader Fritigern cleverly used fake peace talks to stall for time, just long enough for his cavalry to get back from finding food. And then, just as the battle gets going, that cavalry appears as if from nowhere, slamming right into the Roman flank. The legions were completely surrounded, packed so tightly they couldn't even lift their arms to fight, and they were just cut down.
This wasn't just about one army being destroyed. This was a revolution in how wars were fought. For centuries, the disciplined Roman legion had owned the battlefield. But at Adrianople, it was heavy cavalry that won the day. This battle signaled a massive shift that would define European warfare for the next 1,000 years, really paving the way for the age of the medieval knight.
So, what happened next? The central domino had been knocked over. Adrianople proved the empire was vulnerable, that its armies could be beaten, and the consequences of that would reshape the map of Europe forever. After Adrianople, the dominoes fell fast. The Goths were now a permanent power inside the empire. Within just one generation, they would do the unthinkable. They sacked the city of Rome itself. And less than a century after that battle, the Western Roman Emperor was gone for good, replaced by new Germanic kingdoms built right on top of old Roman soil. But what's really fascinating is that the story isn't the same everywhere. It played out so differently. In the West, the new Germanic rulers often adopted Roman ways, their laws, their language, and they eventually just blended into the local populations. But in the East, the Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, it adapted, it changed, and it survived for another 1,000 years, while other groups like the Slavs and the Balkans held on to their own unique cultures.
And that brings us right back to our big question, but now we can look at it from a totally new perspective. Was it really a sudden, cataclysmic fall, or was it something else entirely?
The idea of a single moment of collapse is a great story. It's a compelling myth. But the reality? It was a slow, messy, and pretty brutal transformation. The unified Roman world gave way to this patchwork of kingdoms that would eventually become medieval Europe. So the end of Rome, it wasn't just an ending. It was also the painful birth of a new world, a world whose foundations were laid right there, in the dust of battles like Adrianople.